In 1978, China's GDP per capita was $155. Not $155,000. Not $15,000. $155. That is less than sub-Saharan Africa. Less than Haiti. Less than almost every country on Earth. 9 out of 10 Chinese lived in poverty. There were no highways. No skyscrapers. No private businesses. A farmer in rural Sichuan lived almost exactly the way his great-great-grandfather had, except with fewer calories. That was 48 years ago. Today, China has the second largest economy on Earth, over $18 trillion. It is the world's largest manufacturer, the largest exporter, the largest trading nation. It lifted 800 million people out of extreme poverty, the biggest poverty reduction in human history. It builds trains that go 900 kilometers per hour. It produces 90% of the world's solar panels. Its electric cars are crushing the German auto industry. No country in history has ever risen this fast, this far, for this many people. But the engine that powered this miracle is dying. And this time, the threat is not American tariffs or trade wars. It is something China cannot manufacture, subsidize, or centrally plan its way out of. China is running out of Chinese people. And the mathematics of what comes next will reshape the global economy. This is the nation's wealth records, where every video will change how you see money, history, and the systems controlling your life. If this is your first time here, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. Because what is happening inside China right now is not just a Chinese problem. It is a warning for every nation that confused rapid growth with permanent strength. If you are Chinese or living in China, tell us in the comments, do you feel these cracks in your daily life? We want to hear from people on the ground. How poor China really was. To understand why China's rise is the most extraordinary economic story ever told, you first need to understand just how destroyed the starting point was. When Mao Zedong declared the People's Republic of China in 1949, the country was broken. Over a century of colonial humiliation, civil war, and Japanese invasion had reduced one of history's greatest civilizations to rubble. Industry was non-existent. Literacy was below 20%. Life expectancy was 36 years. Mao tried to fix it with ideology. The Great Leap Forward in 1958 was supposed to industrialize China overnight. Instead, it produced the deadliest famine in human history. Estimates range from 15 to 55 million dead. Entire villages starved. Then came the Cultural Revolution, a decade of political purges, destroyed schools, and intellectual persecution that set the country back another generation. By the time Mao died in 1976, China was still one of the poorest countries on Earth. GDP per capita was barely $165. The economy produced less than Bangladesh. There were no private businesses. No stock market. No property rights. 82% of the population lived in extreme poverty, surviving on less than $2 a day. China did not just start from zero. It started from a hole. Deng Xiaoping and the greatest economic experiment in history. On December 18, 1978, everything changed. Deng Xiaoping launched a policy with a deceptively simple name, reform and opening up. It started in the fields. Under Mao, farmers worked on collective farms and handed everything to the state. Deng introduced the household contract responsibility system, a simple deal. Farmers could keep whatever they produced above their quota. For the first time in decades, a Chinese farmer had a reason to work harder. The results were immediate and staggering. Agricultural output surged. Within 7 years, 200 million farmers lifted themselves out of poverty. Rural markets exploded. But Deng was not finished. He understood something that no other communist leader had ever accepted. To get rich, you must let some people get rich first. He created special economic zones, Shenzhen, Zhuhai, Shantou, Xiamen, small patches of capitalism inside a communist country. Foreign companies could invest, build factories, and hire Chinese workers at wages that were a fraction of what they paid at home. The West got cheap labor. China got technology, management skills, and foreign currency. Shenzhen in 1980 was a fishing village of 30,000 people. Today it is a metropolis of over 17 million, home to Huawei, Tencent, BYD, and DJI. That single city produces more GDP than most European countries. The formula was brutally simple: cheap labor, open markets, massive infrastructure investment, and a government that would do whatever it took to maintain 10% growth. Year after year. Decade after decade. From 1978 to 2010, China averaged 9.8% GDP growth annually. No major economy in history had ever sustained that rate for that long. And then came the infrastructure. China did not just build roads. It built the largest highway network on Earth, over 177,000 kilometers. It built the largest high-speed rail network, over 42,000 kilometers. It built airports, bridges, ports, and power plants at a pace that made the rest of the world look paralyzed. The Chinese had a saying, to get rich, build roads first. And they built them everywhere. In 2001, China joined the World Trade Organization. The floodgates opened. Foreign investment poured in. Chinese exports exploded. Factories sprouted across the Pearl River Delta. China became the factory of the world. Everything from iPhones to furniture to Christmas decorations, made in China. By 2010, China had overtaken Japan to become the second largest economy on Earth. By 2020, it had officially eradicated extreme poverty, an achievement unmatched in scale by any government in history. 800 million people pulled from poverty in 4 decades. Through industrial policy, infrastructure investment, and an almost inhuman national discipline. That is the miracle. And every number is real. But the miracle had a cost. And that cost is now coming due. The first crack appeared where it always appears, in property. For decades, real estate was not just an investment in China. It was the investment. Chinese families poured 70% of their wealth into property. Local governments funded 40% of their budgets by selling land to developers. Developers borrowed massively to build, and banks lent willingly because land values only went up. Construction alone contributed 25 to 30% of GDP. It was a machine that only worked as long as prices kept rising. And in 2021, the machine broke. Evergrande, the country's second largest developer, defaulted on over $300 billion in debt, one of the largest corporate defaults in history. Country Garden followed. Bank, once considered the safest developer in China, began showing signs of stress. Across the country, construction sites went silent. Cranes stopped moving. Millions of apartments that had been pre-sold, paid for in full by families, sat unfinished. In 2025, real estate development investment fell nearly 16%. New construction starts dropped over 20%. This was the 4th consecutive year of contraction. The property crisis is not a housing crisis. It is a financial crisis, a fiscal crisis, and a confidence crisis rolled into one. And Chinese families who put their life savings into apartments that lost 30 to 40% of their value have stopped spending. Retail sales in December 2025 grew just 0.9%, the weakest since late 2022. Consumer confidence is shattered. China's GDP deflator, the broadest measure of prices, has been negative since 2023. The longest deflationary streak on record. China is not just slowing down. China is experiencing what Japan experienced 35 years ago, a property bubble that burst. The one-child policy's revenge. Here is the number that will define China's future: 7.92 million. That is how many babies were born in China in 2025. For a country of 1.4 billion people. That is the lowest since 1939, when China's population was only 400 million. It is barely 2/5 of China's birth total just 9 years earlier. China's population declined by 3.4 million people in 2025. The acceleration is shocking. To understand how China arrived. At this point, you need to understand the one-child policy, arguably the most consequential government policy of the 20th century. In 1980, the Chinese government, terrified of overpopulation, implemented a policy that limited most urban families to one child. It was enforced with fines, job losses, forced sterilizations, and in many cases, forced abortions. For 35 years, the policy reshaped every aspect of Chinese society. It did not just limit births. It rewired culture. It created a generation of only children, called little emperors, who grew up with no siblings, no cousins, and eventually no aunts or uncles. It created a generation of parents who invested everything, emotionally, financially, psychologically, into a single child. When the government finally relaxed the policy in 2016, it expected a baby boom. The boom never came. In 2016, there were 17.9 million births. By 2023, that number had fallen to 9.5 million. By 2025, it collapsed to 7.92 million. The women of childbearing age now number 213 million. By 2050, they will number just 58 million. China's fertility rate has fallen to approximately 1.0 children per woman. Replacement rate is 2.1. China is not just below replacement. It is at half replacement. The government has tried everything. Cash subsidies, extended parental leave, subsidized fertility treatments. None of it worked. Because the decision not to have children is not about money. It is about a generation that watched their parents sacrifice everything for one child, who grew up in a system of crushing academic competition, who face youth unemployment above 16%, and who have simply decided, quietly, individually, irreversibly, that the deal is not worth it. And the deaths are accelerating. In 2025, 11.31 million people died, against 7.92 million births. The population is now shrinking by over 3 million per year. By 2050, China's median age will hit 52. No country in history will have ever been that old. 1 in 3 Chinese will be over 65. And here is the detail that separates China's demographic crisis from Japan's. China is getting old before it got rich. Japan was already one of the wealthiest countries on Earth when its demographic decline began. China's GDP per capita is still only $12,500. The one-child policy was supposed to save China from overpopulation. Instead, it created a demographic time bomb with a 40-year fuse. That fuse has now detonated. Fewer people, less growth, more debt. Demographics are destiny. And China's destiny is now written in mathematics that no 5-year plan can override. Fewer births means fewer future workers. Fewer workers means less production, less tax revenue, less consumption. More elderly means more pension spending, more healthcare costs, more fiscal pressure. The gap between what the government collects and what it must spend widens every year. China's government debt is already rising. Plans for ultra-long-term special treasury bonds continue. Youth unemployment stands at 16.3%. 1 out of every 7 young Chinese cannot find work. The new economy is growing. But it is not growing fast enough to replace the old one. China's great advantage was always scale. 1.4 billion people meant 1.4 billion consumers, 800 million workers, an endless reservoir of talent and labor. That advantage is evaporating. The country that was once too big to fail is becoming too old to grow. And unlike Japan, which stagnated quietly with domestic savings and domestic debt, China is deeply integrated into the global economy. When China slows, the ripple effects are enormous. 20 years ago, a map of the world's top trading partners was almost entirely blue, American. Today, it is almost entirely pink, Chinese. When China's engine sputters, the world feels it. Technological dominance versus demographic decline. And yet, here is what makes China's story different from every other declining power. China is not fading quietly. It is fighting with everything it has. And in many areas, it is winning. CATL makes the best batteries on Earth. BYD makes electric cars that cost $7,000 and outperform German engineering. DeepSeek and Alibaba have produced AI language models that rival anything from Silicon Valley. China has more industrial robots than any other country, nearly 2 million and counting. It is building dark factories, fully automated manufacturing plants with no lights, because only robots work inside. In renewable energy, in electric vehicles, in battery technology, in 5G infrastructure, in high-speed rail, in robotics, China is not just competitive. China is dominant. At the International Mathematical Olympiad, China crushes every country every year. The human capital is extraordinary. This is the paradox. China is simultaneously one of the most technologically advanced countries on Earth, and one of the most demographically doomed. It is racing to automate fast enough to replace the workers it is losing. Robots instead of babies. AI instead of immigration. Technology instead of population. It might work. No country has ever tried it at this scale. But no country has ever faced a demographic decline this severe while still being classified as a developing economy. The race between technological progress and demographic collapse is the defining question of China's next 30 years. And the outcome will determine whether the 21st century belongs to China, or whether China becomes the next Japan. A country that rose to extraordinary heights, peaked, and then entered a slow, quiet descent that lasted generations. China built the most extraordinary economic miracle in human history. In a single lifetime, it went from a country where farmers starved in their fields to a country that builds trains that do not touch the rails. 800 million people lifted from poverty. The greatest achievement in the history of economic development. But the engine that powered that miracle, a massive, young, hungry, disciplined population willing to work for less, build for more, and sacrifice everything for growth, is disappearing. Not because of war. Not because of sanctions. But because of a policy decision made in 1980 whose consequences are now irreversible. China has 30 years to replace human labor with machine intelligence at a scale never attempted in history. If it succeeds, it will be the first civilization to overcome its own demographic decline through technology. If it fails, it will follow Japan into a stagnation from which no country has ever fully recovered. Either way, the world will never be the same. History does not repeat. But if you do not understand it, it will crush you all the same. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. The Nation's Wealth Records. History has the answers. I'll show you where to look.